السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to a live program of Gems of the Heart, where we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts with these gems, with these beautiful verses of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is the only way for someone to purify his heart and to elevate oneself and to be among those who are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking the pleasure of Allah. This is always the intention for anything that we do, whether it's a person talking or a person listening or any action that we do. Our intentions are to be only for the sake of Allah, and we should work on our intentions to make it sincere and pure for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And without these pure intentions, no valid actions will be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For a person deed to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has to be sincere, pure for the sake of Allah, according to the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, according to this wahy revelation from Allah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. We've been talking about the names and attributes of Allah as a way to purify our hearts, and that's one of the most important means to purify our hearts. There's nothing more valuable, more beautiful than to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. And the way that we do this is by looking into the verses of the Quran. This is the way for us to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the Quran is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course in the authentic sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. Ash-Shakoor, and comes with it also Ash-Shakoor. But Ash-Shakoor is the one that is the most grateful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most grateful. And we'll talk about what that means and how does it affect our life and our beliefs, and how does it purify our hearts and actions, and so on and so forth. But before we start with this subject of the names and attributes of Allah, we really, when we look into our life, we're not giving it its rights. And when we give it its rights, it means that we should always witness, believe and witness the effect of these names and attributes of Allah in our life. Because we are ordered to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And when a person doesn't know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his acts of worship will be deficient and not with full submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore this is an essential thing. This is something that is so important. One of the most important things in our life is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The most important thing in our life is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. But how people can know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they do not read the Quran? How would people know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they're not close to the words of Allah? And the only way for us to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is through the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As we said, many other human beings, because they do not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they think bad about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have bad expectations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They let along those who disbelieve in Him. So therefore we need to put the effort. We need to learn the book of Allah. And this is one of the means to learn this, is by listening to some of these benefits mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ with regards to these names and attributes of Allah. So the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor and Ash-Shakir, if we have time we'll talk about them both inshallah ta'ala. As always, we have to go to the Quran and see how this has been explained and what these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means. But when we think about the meaning of Ash-Shakoor, comes from it shukr. We know the word shukr means to be grateful. But what does it mean to come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the grateful one? Usually when people are grateful, that means someone did a favor to them, and they're grateful to the one that did a favor to them. This is how being grateful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in no need of anyone. He is the most rich. He's the creator of all things. He's the one that created us. He created us from nothing. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the provider. He's the sustainer. Everything we have is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing from us benefit Allah, because how can the creation benefit the creator? Nothing from us benefits Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the owner of all things. So what does it mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor? The ulama, they say Ash-Shakoor is the one that accepts the deeds with all kinds of weakness and deficiencies that deeds are done with, and forgive. And He's the most forgiver subhanahu wa ta'ala. He increases and multiplies the good deeds. As we know from the facts mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that al-hasana bi'ashri amthaliha, that the one deed is multiplied by 10. That's the least, that's the minimum. And that shows how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Shakoor. And when it comes to matters of goodness that He gives subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows upon the believers, and all kinds of things, this is all from being a Shakoor. And therefore, when a person is obedient to Allah, the return is all signs of this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The return from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nobody can ever imagine it. The Jannah has no eyes have seen, no ears have heard, no hearts have imagined, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. And we learn from this also for ourselves to be grateful to Allah and to be grateful to others. But as usual, as we said, let's look into the verses in the Quran that talks about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor and Ash-Shakir, and the differences between both by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look into the book of Allah, we would find that the name Ash-Shakoor is mentioned in 4 places in the Quran. The first one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Fatir, verse number 30. In Surah Fatir, verse number 30, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the believers, لِيُوَفِّيَهُمْ أُجُورَهُمْ وَيَزِيدَهُمْ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ إِنَّهُ غَفُورٌ شَكُورٌ. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He would give the rewards for the believers in full. لِيُوَفِّيَهُمْ أُجُورَهُم. Nobody will have less of the rewards that they have been promised with. And more. وَيَزِيدَهُم مِّن فَضْلِهِ. And He would increase them from His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would increase them from His bounty. Therefore He is إِنَّهُ غَفُورٌ شَكُورٌ. He is the most forgiver subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala. Such a beautiful verse that you would see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He bestowed His favor upon His slaves. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that guide them. He subhanahu wa ta'ala the one that promises them. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala the one that made it easy for them to do the good deeds, and He would fulfill and give them the rewards in full, and He would increase out of His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how this is linked to Ghafurun Shakoor. Why? When it's mentioned about the good deeds and given them the rewards in full, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would forgive their weaknesses in their actions. The good deeds that we are ordered to do, we are ordered to do it in a perfect way. When we are ordered to establish the salah in the most perfect way, to have khushu' in the salah, we know our weaknesses and we know that our hearts drifts away sometimes. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. He's Ghafoor. He forgives if a person has the truthfulness and the sincerity and doing things the best that a person can and so on. He forgives subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He gives more out of His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala, multiplication of the rewards, all by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a very important meaning that when a person is being guided to do a good deed, not to think that we did great or we're perfecting our actions. We need to humble ourselves. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the best of the rewards. When we see ourselves that we are deficient, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserve far more than what we're doing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do simple things. Otherwise, in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the owner of all things, the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala, He deserves from us to worship Him in every single second of our life. That the entire life of the human being should be in the state of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in such a way that He accepts these simple deeds. What is 5 times a day salah only? It's only 5 times, it's not 50. It's not the entire day and night. Most of the day and the night is given for worldly things and so on, and then 5 daily salah only. A person becomes deficient in it. How ungrateful is the human beings? And the human beings are not grateful to Allah. And that's why we need to be grateful to Allah by fulfilling the obligations and the orders of Allah in the most perfect way. And that's one of the benefits of learning this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He ordered us to do very simple deeds in the capacity of each and every one of us. And when a person have faults and weaknesses in it, He is Ghafoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the most forgiver. And He is Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one verse that we heard, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give the rewards in full, and He increase out of His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He's the most forgiver, the Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the word Shakoor is someone that is grateful at all times. It's far more than just Shakir as one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Shakir, and it's mentioned twice in the Quran as we'll talk about it inshallah ta'ala. But the difference between both is Shakur is more. That means whether it's in the context of giving or whether in the context of being tried and tested, he is Shakur subhanahu wa ta'ala at all levels under any situation. One of the verses also that talks about this in Surah Ash-Shura, ayah number 23. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يَقْتَرِفْ حَسَنَةً نَزِدْ لَهُ فِيهَا حُسْنًا إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ شَكُورٌ. The same ending of the verse is repeated, غَفُورٌ شَكُورٌ. And in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, a part of the verse, وَمَنْ يَقْتَرِفْ حَسَنَةً, whoever do a good deed, نَزِدْ لَهُ فِيهَا حُسْنًا, we will increase in it for him حُسْنًا, goodness. And you see the same meaning is repeated. That what is repeated is that they will be given more than what they just did. And the word نقترف that means, or يقترف means that someone did action that maybe required struggle and patience. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ شَكُورٌ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive the weakness and the deficiency of the slave of Allah, that it was difficult for him to do the acts of obedience to Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was grateful to him that he increased and multiplied the rewards for him. And this is what the glad tidings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is given to the believers, that he is Ash-Shakoor, something that brings so much joy in the hearts of the believers, and it brings shyness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like this, then why are we not fulfilling the rights of Allah? Why we are deficient in our ibadah, in our worship of Allah? Where is our times are going and being spent in what? Isn't it worth it that we spend our time in the worship of Allah and increasing the good deeds and staying away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade and so on? Another place in the Quran where it mentions also good deeds and also mention the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Ash-Shakoor, this is in Surah At-Taghabun. Surah At-Taghabun, verse number 17. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن تُقْرِضُوا اللَّهَ قَرْضًا حَسَنًا يُضَاعِفْهُ لَكُمْ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ شَكُورٌ حَلِيمٌ. Here the verse ends with Shakurun Halim, not Ghafurun Shakur. So what does the verse mean? And of course the context of the verse gives the explanation to this. إِن تُقْرِضُوا اللَّهَ قَرْضًا حَسَنًا. If you give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goodly loan, that means if you give charity for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And قَرْضًا حَسَنًا, that means the person give it with goodness in his heart, not out of being shy or feeling unease when he's given. He's given it with so much goodness inside of him that he is more happy than the one that receives the charity. The person that is a giver, he's more happy with him giving charity than the one that receives the charity. Why? Because he's given it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will multiply his rewards. يُضَاعِفْهُ لَكُمْ, that he would multiply it for you. And then, وَاللَّهُ شَكُورٌ حَلِيمٌ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Shakur and he is Halim. He is the most forbearing subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because no matter how much a person do of the good deeds, right, it's something that is nothing compared to the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No matter what a person do of the good deeds, it's all little. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserve from us to do more and more of the good deeds, even though he multiply it, because he is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. Really the reality of, as we hear from this, that the slave of Allah, if he's treated by the justice of Allah, he deserves to be punished because we are weak and deficient. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Shakur and he's Halim. He's forbearing subhanahu wa ta'ala. He does not punish his slaves immediately. He gives them time to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he ordered them to give charity to elevate their levels and to forgive their sins and so on. And as the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said in the authentic hadith that if a man was to be on his face, dragged on his face, from the moment that he was born till he died, he would see that this is something that is nothing in the day of judgment. And even the hadith says that وَلَوْ أَنَّ رَجُلًا يَخِرُّ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ, if a man is on his face مِنْ يَوْمِ وُلِد, from the day that he was born, إِلَى يَوْمِ يَمُوت, till the day that he dies, Hariman, that means old in age. That means he lived a long life. And the entire life is being dragged on his face. If he's doing this, في مرضات الله عز وجل. If this what he was suffering, for the sake of Allah. That means it's all good deeds for him. With this amount of suffering, all for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's going to happen to that person in the day of judgment? لَحَقَّرَهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. He would look as this deed is nothing in the day of judgment. He would see as this is something so little when it comes to the deeds. Not that this is, I did great and so on. He would see it in the day of judgment as something very little. So what's going to save him then in the day of judgment? Is it his actions? That he did all of this for the sake of Allah, suffering for the sake of Allah the entire life. He would see this as nothing in the day of judgment. So what's then going to be the reward for him? It's the mercy of Allah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. That He multiplies the rewards of His slaves for the simple deeds that they do. So the fact is that it's not the amount of deeds and how great these deeds are that will be the price of entering Jannah. It's not like a right of a person. When it comes to the rights, we have no rights whatsoever upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made upon Himself by His mercy subhanahu wa ta'ala and His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala. That all of these rewards that are mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ about the actions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in no need, no obligation whatsoever to give these promises and to give this reward. It's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Shakoor. Something that a believer would have in his heart the perfect love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of these types and names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is basically the meaning of having this shukr, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. He's the one that is the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore for the human beings they need to be grateful to Allah. And this is something that we'll talk about inshallah ta'ala later, that for us to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that means to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our actions and so on. Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, and this is the fourth position here that we are looking into this. This is the fourth one that we said, Wallahu Shakoorun Halim. So 4 verses in the book of Allah that talks about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor. The ulama, when they talked about this, and then when they mentioned the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they also mentioned something very important. When a person do the good deeds, we're supposed to have this tranquility in our hearts. The good deeds gives us this goodness in our hearts that we want to do more of the good deeds. Gives us the happiness of this life and in the hereafter. This is all signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Shakoor. He's grateful. Because as a sign of being grateful to your actions, and He is in no need of us whatsoever, that you would find this pleasant feeling that you want to do more and more of the good deeds. If a person doesn't have this, that means that's a sign that maybe the deed was not good enough, was not done in the right way. And that's why we need to purify our actions. We need to have more sincerity in it. We need to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ and to be patient. And therefore these deeds will bring happiness to us. If it doesn't, again as we said, that means our actions are not perfect. We need to perfect it. We need to seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for us to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is Ash-Shakoor. He is Ash-Shakoor. He's the one that is the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the rewards are nothing whatsoever when it comes to what's compared to the action itself. It's much, much more in multiplication, all as a result of this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we talk about the shukr as an act of worship, which is one of the signs that a believer is believing in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor, a person is being grateful to Allah by fulfilling these simple deeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most grateful and gives so much multiplication and rewards as a result of these simple deeds. So do these simple deeds. Do not add more. Do not take anything from it. And that's why the bid'ah or innovation in the deen is forbidden in the deen of Islam. To innovate, to invent acts of worship. If a person invent an act of worship, that takes him away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person might have good intentions, that he believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a shakur, and therefore he wants to do more of the good deeds. More of the good deeds according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, not according to our own desires. So therefore, to be grateful to Allah, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His name Ash-Shakoor, if He multiplies the rewards because of these actions, that means we need to fulfill these actions according to the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His name Ash-Shakoor. Always the subject of Ash-Shukr and Al-Hamd, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also is Al-Hamid, the one that is full of praise subhanahu wa ta'ala. When it comes to the shukr, usually it's something that is in return of something. That's why the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor, is in return of the deeds of the people. Even though, again, as we said, the deeds of the people are nothing compared to the gratefulness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the rewards from Allah, but He subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. He has the perfect names and attributes subhanahu wa ta'ala. The word or the name Shakir has the same meaning that He is grateful to His slaves and He is in no need of them. He's given the rewards in so much multiplication and He is the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Shakir, which gives the same meaning, but when you put them both together, Ash-Shakoor and Ash-Shakoor is more general than the Shakir. Shakir is one time or specifically to specific situation, but Ash-Shakoor is the one that is so much of this attribute is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Shakir, is mentioned in the Quran in 2 times, and it's linked to Shakirun Alim, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is grateful and He is Alim, He is the all-knower subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is, for example, mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah in the ayah, إِنَّ الصَّفَا وَالْمَرْوَةَ مِنْ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ فَمَنْ حَجَّ الْبَيْتَ أَوْ اعْتَمَرَ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْهِ أَنْ يَطَّوَّفَ بِهِمَا وَمَنْ تَطَوَّعَ خَيْرًا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ شَاكِرٌ عَلِيمٌ, which means that indeed the Safa and the Marwa is from the sha'air of Allah. It's part of the Hajj and the Umrah. So whoever make Hajj or make Umrah, there is no harm for them if they make tawaf between the Safa and Marwa. It means that this is part of the Umrah, part of the Hajj. وَمَنْ تَطَوَّعَ خَيْرًا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ شَاكِرٌ عَلِيمٌ, that whoever do more of the optional acts of worship, or when it comes to the context of this verse, whoever do this act of worship which is part of Umrah and part of Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Shakirun Alim. He is the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is the all-knower subhanahu wa ta'ala. It shows here how if people are doing the good deeds at times of ease, when a person goes for Hajj and Umrah and make the sa'i between the Safa and the Marwa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is grateful. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is grateful, He knows best who's doing things for the sake of Allah and who is not doing it for the sake of Allah. So therefore, for a person to worship Allah with this name of Allah, Shakir, is to have in our hearts this purity, this sincerity, that a person is doing it only for the sake of Allah. If a person has this sincerity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be grateful to his deeds, meaning that He will multiply the rewards and not just simple acceptance. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of this. Inshallah, we'll go to break and come back with your phone calls and more of the explanation of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor, after the break. So stay with us, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back. And we're talking about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor and Ash-Shakir, the most grateful. And how that means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives so much rewards for these simple deeds that He ordered us to do. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala is in no need of His creation whatsoever. But He is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala, something that brings the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts. If we talk about the many verses in the Quran, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talks about the rewards, you would see that it's not really equivalent to the action. The action is very simple. And the deeds of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are so great that nobody can even comprehend it. And that's basically the essence of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor. When it comes to charity, for example, and we talked about this in the context of charity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in matters of charity, that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that if a person gives charity, but with the condition that it's pure, it's halal, وَلَا يَقْبَلُ اللَّهُ إِلَّا طَيِّبًا, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept anything but what's pure and what's halal, what's permissible. That's one of the intentions of seeking halal money, halal wealth, to work in such a halal way, to stay away from the haram, so that your charity is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the charity is given, even if it's something little, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase it for the person day after day. Even if it's one tamra, as it's mentioned in the hadith. One tamra, one date that a person gives it for the sake of Allah from pure sources, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is Ash-Shakoor. It is not written for the person that he gave just one date. That person comes in the day of judgment and he finds mountains of dates. It's this one date that he gave for the sake of Allah. It's multiplied for him as if he gave all of that for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, He increase it for you like you raise your pony, a small horse, how you raise it to become very strong and big. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the charity is received by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes it with His right hand, as the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said. Aisha radiallahu anha, when she would give charity, even if it's something small, because she heard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. Whoever do the weight of a mustard seed, or something very small, of goodness, he would see it. And whoever do the weight of something evil, very small, he will see it. So she would give whatever she has, even if it's a date, that she would split it into half and she would give it for the sake of Allah, which is one of the great benefits to learn when it comes to matters of or believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. How can we then change our life as a result of this belief? One of the great effects in our life is that we would never belittle a good deed. We would basically be so eager to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised the believers, the rewards of the good deeds, and then we would do these good deeds seeking the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala, and never to belittle anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do. If it's wahi, if it's revelation from Allah, never belittles it. Whether it's even a smile to a Muslim, as the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, وَتَبَسُّمُكْ فِي وَجْهِ أَخِيكَ صَدَقَةً. When you smile to your Muslim brother, this is sadaqah, this is charity. Who said this? The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. This is revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. That means do this act of worship, do this good deed, and do not belittle it whatsoever. And don't wait just for the major ones, but do whatever a person has the means to do, of course by fulfilling the obligations first. And the good deeds and the optional acts of worship are not rewarded unless a person fulfill and secures the obligations and staying away from haram and so on. So never to belittle any of the good deeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do. And therefore it's a duty really to learn these actions. Like making salah on the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, Man salla alayya marra. Whoever made salah to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam only one time, when you say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, and so on, one time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would do the same for you 10 times. This is not equivalent to this. You know, if it's 1 versus 1, it's understood, but 1 versus 10. And the salah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the person, meaning that that person will be praised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Can we imagine such a thing? Person will be praised 10 times in the best gatherings, in the gatherings of the angels, when a person makes salah on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning that a person is asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to praise the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Great rewards, and the shafa'ah and the intercession of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the day of judgment and so on. We can go on and on with this, with all of the rewards of the good deeds, the adhkar, what to say in the morning and in the evening, the salah, the charity, the good deeds and so on. And one simple thing that really, if a person have the reality of it, it can, take the hearts away of the people, which is فَاذْكُرُونِ أَذْكُرُكُمْ وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, remember me, I will remember you. And be grateful to Allah, and do not be ungrateful to Allah. If you make remembrance of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would remember you. This is something that is unimaginable. Something when it comes to the rewards, nobody can comprehend it whatsoever. And this is with certainty, this is exactly what happens. So when a person is making remembrance of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is remembering him. If he is in himself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is remembering him in himself, as the hadith says. If it's in a mala', in a group of people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it in a mala' that is better than his mala', better than the gathering that he's in. So constantly making ourselves busy to make the remembrance of Allah, to study the deen, to spread the deen, to make the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and never to belittle any of the good deeds. And actually, this is one of the things that brings another great benefit when it comes to believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that is Ash-Shakoor, the one that is grateful, as some of the narrations from the prophets of Allah, like Musa alayhi salam, when he said to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "O my Lord, I conveyed the message, and that is from you." You know, the work of the prophets of Allah, nobody can reach this level. And they saw their actions as nothing, as we said. This attitude is a way of being grateful to Allah. When you see yourself that you're not doing what is sufficient, you're not doing anything, it's all by the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you keep on doing the good deeds. So he said, I conveyed the message, and that's from you. The help is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, and if I prayed, it's from you. And if I make remembrance to you, it's from you, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, guidance from Allah. So then this is what it said, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to him, when he said to him, how can I be grateful to you when everything is from you? He said, now you are grateful to me. Meaning that when you feel that you cannot fulfill really the greatness or to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with your actions, because no matter what you do, it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This attitude, this deed done by the heart, this is a sign that a person is grateful to Allah. So we need to be grateful to Allah because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. And therefore when a person is tested by a trial or difficulty or sickness or loss of wealth or whatever there is, a person should have good expectations of Allah. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor at times of ease and at times of difficulties. Never to think that if you're faced with difficulties and others are not, that this will be wasted. That these people that are not facing difficulties while you're facing it, they are better than you. It doesn't have to be this way. It all depends on how you are facing these difficulties. If a person is afflicted with trial, being poor, lost his health, whatever difficulties that a person faces in this life, if he opposes this by being grateful to Allah, by seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's one of the differences between Ash-Shakoor and Ash-Shakir. Ash-Shakoor is at all levels, at all times, whether at times of ease or times of difficulties. And when a person is grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala, when a person is patient at times of difficulties, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. He is the most grateful to your patience. It's not going to be wasted, but not to do the opposite of patience or to be pleased with the qadr of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. And therefore the reward is something that nobody can comprehend whatsoever. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentioned in the Quran that He rewards the patient ones without reckoning, بغير حساب, without account whatsoever, without limits, because He is Ash-Shakoor. The good deeds, usually, the good deed is multiplied by 10 and so on. But when it comes to sabr, that means a person is facing a difficulty. And that's not something that is pleasing to oneself, but he's enduring patience for the sake of Allah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then, being Ash-Shakoor, He rewards those who are patient in rewards that nobody can ever comprehend. There's no limits to it whatsoever. And therefore a person should think and always have the hearts attached to the rewards from Allah, that it's far more than the actions that a person do. So to get to learn the deen of Allah, to get to learn the virtues of the deeds, so that a person worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His name Ash-Shakoor. Also for the person to belittle our actions after doing the best we can, that everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the way to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he talked about the one that gives and the one that is grateful and the one that feeds others as a result of being grateful to Allah. Giving charity for the sake of Allah as a way of being grateful to Allah, that Allah bestowed His favor upon us for giving us wealth, for giving us health, to use it for the sake of Allah, to give da'wah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to invite people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to get people to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, to learn the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with that intention. That makes the person always obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nations, when they're not grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this can be a sign of their destruction. And for them to be grateful to Allah, and that is to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that bestowed these favors upon them, they need to be grateful to Allah because He is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that therefore those who are in state of shukr and being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will save them in the hereafter, will save them from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي مَنْ شَكَرَ. It's always mentioned in the Quran that we would give the reward of those who are grateful to Allah. Those who are grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward them. And to be grateful to Allah, it's in the heart, in the tongue, in the physical actions. This is to be grateful to Allah in the heart. When a person sees again that, it's really, when someone is not grateful to Allah because of a difficulty, usually people when they have ease, they have wealth and health and so on, they would say that they're grateful to Allah. But what if they don't have it? They still should be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing them with a different act of worship for them to be patient, because life is only temporary one. And anything that a person faces on the face of earth, he can get great rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to see things from this perspective, so when a person is patient, when a person is pleased with the qadr of Allah, he should be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Shakoor, that he gives the rewards from him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to be grateful to Allah, to be in the hearts being grateful to Allah like this, and to say words of being grateful to Allah, to mention the favors of Allah, to count the favors of Allah, and we would never be able to count them, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. But when someone complains and he says, why this is happening to me, why this is happening, why the situation is like this and this, it's a bad sign that the person is not being grateful to Allah. Doesn't mean that we should not say things in the real way and form, so that maybe seeks a solution to his problems, but in the heart a person is pleased with the fact that this is the action of Allah. You can complain about an individual not being just towards you, it doesn't mean that you're ungrateful to Allah. But when it comes to the action of Allah, why this is decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for us to be more obedient to Allah. You're being tested with your children, so that you would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more, so that you would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. Because everything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so beautiful, and anything that a person faces in this life, whether it's good or bad, a person can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his names and attributes, one of which is to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that is present in the hearts of the believers. And that's why this love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be translated into actions. And to love those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is all ways of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by having the love for the sake of Allah. أوثق عرى الإيمان, the most highest and the most tight knot of al-Iman is to love for the sake of Allah, and to hate for the sake, to love for the sake of Allah, and to hate for the sake of Allah. Everything is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most grateful. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He bestowed His favors upon us, these favors are tests from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fact that we're alive, it's a great favor from Allah. So why are we alive today? For us to repent to Allah, for us to fulfill the obligations, to pray the 5 daily prayers, to be kind to the neighbor, to do the good deeds, to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ, to learn the deen of Allah, to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how to be grateful to Allah that He gave us this favor. The same way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the ability to do something, use it for the sake of Allah, and so on. That's how the Prophet ﷺ used to be. This is how the companions of the Prophet ﷺ used to be, living their life with this hope and the fear of the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and never to belittle any of the good deeds, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most grateful. And as we said before the break, that brings happiness in the hearts of the believers. Sheikh rahimahullah, he mentioned something in the meaning of which, that if a person doesn't feel content and happiness in the life of being obedient to Allah, he need to really recheck his intentions, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. He's the most grateful subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He would reward you by making you more steadfast on the deen of Allah. That makes the person steadfast on the truth, to the hasana, the good deed is to be followed by another hasana, and so on. And that's why when a person is not checking what's in the hearts, and that's the importance of purifying ourselves and our hearts, makes the actions purely for the sake of Allah, and one of which is to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by learning these rewardable acts and these virtues of actions as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do and to follow the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. We see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that He is the all-knower subhanahu wa ta'ala. So He knows who's deserve and who does not deserve. And that's why these multiplications of the rewards, which is the sign of being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most grateful, it's given to people different. People will be given different things, different rewards. Why? According to how much they are grateful. So the reward is given from the same sort of deed that they do. The more they are grateful to Allah, the more they fulfill the acts of worship sincerely for the sake of Allah, the more they follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is grateful for their actions. And that requires the patience of being struggling and being obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. So you might feel that you have been given so much of the favors of Allah, but how this is translated into our actions? Are we fulfilling the rights of these favors to keep it? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, وَلَئِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ, that if you are grateful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you more. If you're grateful that you are a Muslim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase your Islam. If you're grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided you to pray Salatul Fajr in the masjid, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will keep you steadfast on this. And so on. If you're grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you health, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you more, and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most grateful. You become grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you more of this. Also, when we heard in the verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indeed, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ شَاكِرٌ عَلِيمٌ, indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is grateful and He's the all-knower, that means this is no doubt about it whatsoever. It would never fail as long as a person is sincere, seeking the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is there a specific dua where the Prophet ﷺ used to say with the matter of being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or using the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ash-Shakoor and so on? The Prophet ﷺ, the famous dua that he used to say, Allahumma a'inni ala dhikrika wa shukrika wa husni ibadatik. Oh Allah, guide me, Allahumma a'inni ala dhikrik, to be upon your remembrance, to make remembrance of Allah, wa shukrik, and to be grateful to Allah, wa husni ibadatik, and to perfect your ibadah. When a person do this dua, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said it to Mu'adh radiallahu anh, and he said that, O Mu'adh, wallahi inni uhibbuk, that, O Mu'adh, I love you, so never leave this dua after each salah. So to put the effort that you would never miss this dua at the end of every salah. This is by itself is a sign that a person is grateful to Allah, because he's asking. Any good deed that we have in our life or you're seeking, we need to seek it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's one of the most important means to achieve this goodness in our life and to strengthen our iman. So therefore, when a person wants to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his name Ash-Shakoor, is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for oneself to be grateful to Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran that about the human beings, وَإِذَا أَنْعَمْنَا عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ نَأَى أَعْرَضَ وَنَأَى بِجَانِبِهِ, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows a favor upon the human being, what happens? He turns away. It's supposed to be the opposite. And for those who do not turn away and they turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with being grateful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakoor. And if harm happens to them, فَيَأُوسٌ قَنُوطٌ, he gives up. He thinks that he's never going to be given all kinds of, or any goodness whatsoever. No, have good hope from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that cures. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that bestows. So definitely to always be hopeful and to know that you're worshipping the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make you receive the effect of Him being Ash-Shakoor and the rewards to be multiplied, also be grateful to others. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said in the authentic hadith, مَا لَمْ يَشْكُرِ النَّاسِ لَمْ يَشْكُرِ اللَّهِ, whoever is not grateful to the people, he's not grateful to Allah. So when people do a favor to yourself, you should be grateful to them and thank them for what they did, and this is by itself is an act of worship. Why? Because the person then is being grateful to Allah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that guided them. And that's why when we say Jazakallahu khairan, this is the most perfect way to reward someone when he do a favor to you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. And this is something that the Prophet ﷺ even said, Man ata ilaykum ma'rufan fakafi'uh. Whoever do a good thing for you, give them something in reward. Being grateful. And that's why to be grateful to the people is a sign that a person is grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are many benefits to learn and great meanings to be for a person to benefit from when we talk about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the most important thing that I want to leave you with before we end the program because of the time is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His reward is far more without even limitations of our imagination than these simple actions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do. So we need to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accordingly and to do the deeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us and to hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He is Ash-Shakoor subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of this and to make us among those who are grateful to Allah. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.